Welcome to week 6 of Restored. We've come a long way in our journey of personal restoration, a restoration of a career, restoration of a relationship, restoration of something in our life. And there's great power in restoration. I just bring us all the way back to the beginning, that the reason why restoration is so important, because it's important to God. That from start to finish, from the beginning of the Bible all the way to the very end, there is this theme, this overarching theme of God's restoration, restoring humanity, restoring creation. So restoration is pretty important. I think I mentioned it at the very first session that if I were God, I would have just crumpled everything up, thrown it away, and started brand new. And that's nothing to God. God created everything originally. He created everything out of nothing. So certainly God could take something and totally redo it. But God decided that what He was about, as part of His character, is to restore us and restore creation, which I'm grateful for because we're here talking because of God's restoration. Today we're looking at the 6th part of our process towards restoration, which is rebuilding trust. I would say this is probably the most difficult and probably the most pivotal in terms of full restoration of any relationship. Any relationship that's been damaged by broken trust, well, it takes a long time, and it is quite strategic in terms of how we rebuild trust. Well, it's damaging to trust too soon, and it's damaging to never trust again to a relationship. Years ago, I lived in this condominium. It was a small 2-bedroom condominium. It was upstairs, so you had to take the stairs to go up to this little condominium in Southern California. And I like Siberian Huskies, and so we bought a small Siberian Husky puppy and took it home, and thought it would be great to have it and raise that little puppy until it became a little more mature. And then that dog gave me fits. If there was a dog that could be demon possessed, that was one that was. That dog, we had this wooden deck. It dug through the wooden deck just to make a hole to see if it could see what was below it, maybe to get out. We had to trap it in the deck to keep it from running away. And that was another thing. That dog, as soon as it got out, off the leash, it would run. You couldn't catch it. Wait till you got close and then run away from you. It was playing a game with you. It was terrible. If there was any food left on the counter, I remember one time we left this hamburger meat out, came home and it was gone somehow off the kitchen counter or actually out of the sink. Couldn't figure out where it went. Well, the dog had eaten it. Ate all the cellophane, ate the hamburger meat, left the little styrofoam stuff underneath the bed. I got so fed up with that dog, I actually paid money for a professional trainer to come and to teach that dog not to run away. Because when that dog would run away, it was an hour or more to try and finally trap it in a corner to where you could get the dog, put it back on a leash and get it home. The trainer spent, I think if I remember right, 5 sessions with that dog. At the end, he said, "This dog is untrainable." He gave up and gave us the money back for the dog. So I realized, you know what? This dog, I can't trust this dog. There is no way for me to have a meaningful relationship with this dog. I was angry with the dog all the time. It wasn't a healthy situation for the dog or for me. So we found somebody who had this really big piece of property out in the country. They wanted the Siberian Husky, and that dog ended up living its best life, roaming around that countryside and on that property, expending its energy, which is probably what the problem was. It was just wanting to do something, and being cooped up in a little 2-bedroom upstairs condominium, apartment-sized room was not enough for that dog. So it reminds me of this. In any relationship, if a relationship is going to work and you don't want to kill each other, if it's going to be healthy, you have to have trust that the one person isn't going to run away when you take them off the leash. But you don't want to feel like you always have to keep them on the leash either, because that's not trust. That's not relationship. And I want to bring us to a portion of Scripture. It actually comes out of Genesis, and speaking of Joseph. In Genesis chapter 42 all the way to chapter 45, we're not going to read all that Scripture. We're just going to highlight some of the Scriptures in that story that talks about Joseph and how trust was rebuilt between he and his brothers. Now, here's how the story gets set up. Joseph was one of the youngest. He wasn't the youngest. Benjamin ended up being the youngest, but he was one of the youngest of his brothers. His brothers were born by a different mother, and he and Benjamin were born by the mother that his father favored. And so Joseph was favored by his father, and it became obvious. It was probably not a healthy family environment. Joseph was given a coat of many colors. His brothers, they had the beige coats, and Joseph got the really nice fancy coat. Joseph had this dream one night where all these stalks of wheat bowed down to him as the one sole wheat, and he told his brothers, "Hey, I had this dream. You're all going to bow down to me. You're all going to serve me." I mean, that didn't go over well. Can you imagine being in a large family and one of the brothers says, "Hey, by the way, you're all going to serve me. I'm going to rule over you"? I mean, in any family, that wouldn't go over well. Well, the jealousy kept building until finally the brothers saw an opportunity to get rid of him. I mean, they were so jealous, so angry with Joseph, they wanted to kill him. Well, it just so happened that just before they were going to throw him in a pit and kill him, that this caravan of slave traders came by and they sold Joseph into slavery. The slave traders went down to Egypt, and there Joseph was sold into slavery to Potiphar. Potiphar was a wealthy man who had a wife that, well, she lacked good moral character. She saw Joseph and found him attractive, and she wanted him to sleep with her. She cornered him, kind of like I would corner that Siberian Husky. She cornered him, and he said, "No, I can't do this. It would be disrespectful to your husband, disrespectful to the Lord." And she grabbed his cloak, and he ran off without his cloak. Well, she was embarrassed, humiliated, didn't like the rejection that she felt, so she accused Joseph of trying to rape her. Potiphar naturally had him thrown into prison. Now Joseph's in prison. Two guys have dreams, a baker and a wine taster, and Joseph interprets their dream. He tells them that one is going to be killed, the other one's going to be forgiven by the king and given life and position. Well, both those dreams come to pass just as Joseph had interpreted it. Sometime later, the king has a dream. He has a dream, and none of his magicians, none of his wise counsel can interpret what the dream is. It's this dream about the 7 cattle that are healthy and the 7 cattle that are weak and emaciated. And he can't figure out what it means. And so the wine taster, he says, "Hey, there was a guy in prison that interpreted my dream and the baker's dream, and it came true exactly as he said." So the king sends for Joseph. Joseph goes, interprets the dream that there'll be 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. Voila! Joseph is taken out of prison. He's actually given a great position in the kingdom. He proves himself to be a great administrator and very, very wise. He's now second in command of all of Egypt. And just as Joseph had interpreted the dream to be, there were 7 years of abundance, and then the 7 years of famine started kicking in. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph was in charge of storing the grain to a point where there could be enough left over to help them get through those 7 years of famine. Well, the famine also hits Joseph's family, and so the father says, "Hey, would you go to Egypt and get some grain for us? I heard they have grain." And so the sons, they get some donkeys and pack animals, and they go to Egypt, and there they're confronted with their brother. Now they don't know it's Joseph because he looks totally different now. He's grown up. He's been enculturated by the Egyptian culture, and they think he's dead, right? They can't imagine they would ever see him again. So they don't know it's Joseph. Joseph then develops this elaborate scheme to put them to the test. Here's what he's doing. He's going to put them through a whole lot of tests or hoops in order to see whether they're trustworthy. What he's doing is he's delaying reconciliation, or we might say he's delaying restoration until they've proven to be trustworthy. That's important. Delayed trust can be very, very important in any kind of a relationship. If we just quickly run back into the relationship, or we make everything back normal right away, that can be unhealthy for sure for the one who's been offended. They may get, this repeat offense may happen over and over again because there's no real delay that allows trust to be rebuilt. And then secondly, the offender can actually be affected, where they've not really taken the time to deal with why they did what they did, and so they keep repeating the same mistake over and over again. And I don't know if Joseph thought all this through, but there just was a wisdom. Obviously, there was a wisdom, which is why he was elevated to second in command in all of Egypt, about how to deal with people. And the way to deal with people was to really observe whether they were trustworthy or not. So write this down. Jesus says this in Matthew chapter 3, verse 8. He says, produce fruit in keeping with repentance. This is what I think Jesus is saying. And this is what we're really going to look at over the next few minutes. And that is this, that trust isn't a declaration. It's an observation. Trust is not a declaration, I trust you, or I'm trustworthy. It's not a declaration, it's an observation. And so we're going to look today at 5 observations that come out of Joseph's interactions with his brothers so that he could determine during this delayed period of time whether they were trustworthy or not. I've heard it said this way, that love is automatic, trust is earned. You maybe have heard that too. In Genesis chapter 42, verse 20, it says, but you must bring your youngest brother, this is Joseph talking to his brothers, you must bring your younger brother to me so that your words may be verified and that you may not die. And this they proceeded to do. So here's what Joseph is saying. I'm putting you to the test to see if you're really trustworthy. I'm going to test you. I'm going to observe whether you're really trustworthy or not. And if you are, then goodness, blessings going to happen to you. What observations can we have that produced a renewed trust? Here's the first one. Here's the first observation. Write this down. They choose me at the expense of their own desires. They choose me at the expense of their own desires. Now, where does that come from? In the story, in Genesis chapter 44, verse 33, the brothers have come and they've gotten the grain, and what Joseph does is he puts the silver that they had given back in their sacks, and he really kind of sets them up for success. But then they run out of food again. And they were told that you got to bring your youngest brother. And if you don't bring your youngest brother, you can't get any more food. Anyhow, long story short, it says this in Genesis chapter 44, verse 33. Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. This is in place of Benjamin. And let the boy return with his brothers. So here's what Judah is saying. Judah is saying, I'm favoring my father over my own life. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing someone else over myself. I'm not being self-centered. I'm being God-centered. I'm being other-centered. So the backstory to this is, Joseph sets them up to look like they were stealing from them. He actually had the special chalice put in Benjamin's bag. And when they discovered that it was there, well, right at about the same time, some of Joseph's men come, grab them, take them back. And this is part of Joseph's plan to see if they're trustworthy. Brings them all back to Egypt and says, why did you do this? Why did you steal? I'm taking Benjamin. I'm going to hold him prisoner because he stole the chalice. And they're saying, no, he didn't. We didn't do it. It just happened to be there. And then Judah steps in and he says, listen, take me. You can even kill me, but my father will die if Benjamin doesn't come back. Now they don't know it's Joseph speaking to him. His other son, whom he loved, was taken from him. He is no more. That's what the scripture says. If Benjamin doesn't come back, he will certainly die out of remorse, out of grief. So Judah says, hey, he says this, I don't choose myself, I'm choosing my father. That was important. It was important in terms of the observation. Can we see that the person is trustworthy? Over time, if people really are earning your trust, they choose you over and over and over again, rather than choosing their own pleasure or themselves. What's the second observation? Write this down. They willingly submit to scrutiny in the area of their failure. They willingly submit to scrutiny in the area of their failure. Notice in chapter 42, verses 21 through 23, the brothers are seeing that things are going south, things are really bad. Joseph, whom they don't know is their brother, is not speaking to them favorably. And this is how they respond to each other. In Genesis chapter 42, 21 through 23, it says, they said to one another, surely we are being punished because of our brother, speaking of Joseph, whom they sold into slavery. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded for his life, but we would not listen. This is why this distress has come on us. Verse 22, Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an account for his blood. They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. The brothers in this moment took ownership. They said, okay, we messed up, we sinned, we blew it. Somebody who is wanting to earn back trust will allow for scrutiny in the area of their failure. So, as an example, let's say you're a married couple and there's been financial infidelity. One person just rang up the credit cards, buying everything under the sun, and all of a sudden you get to this point and you see all these credit card bills and you go, we can't pay these. What are we going to do? Well, here's what, if the person really wants to earn back trust, they don't just say, well, trust me, I'm fine. I'm over it now. I won't do that again. No, you actually cut up the credit cards, cut them up, and you no longer are allowed to have credit cards. And you might even submit yourself to a budget, to an allowance. You get X amount of dollars, and once you spend that X amount of dollars, you don't get any more money. Now, a person who isn't willing to really earn back trust will fight that. They'll resist it tooth and nail. They'll actually turn it back on you. They'll say, well, don't you trust me? And the answer would be, no, I don't trust you. That's the right answer, by the way. No, I don't trust you. You just rang up so many bills, we can't pay it. You put us in financial jeopardy. No, you're not trust. No, I don't trust you. That's the right answer. But I want to trust you. That's also the right answer. I want to rebuild trust. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to come up with a plan, a strategy where you can rebuild that trust. We're going to cut up the credit cards. We're going to put you on a budget, and we're going to figure out how we can climb out of this hole that we are in. So trust requires an acknowledgement of the failure and a willingness on both parties, a willingness of the offender to say, I submit to whatever plan we need to come up with in order to rebuild trust, but also the offended to begin to give in over time, to not hold the leash so tight that you always keep them close. But after trust begins to build, you let the leash out a little bit more and more and more. I know that sounds terrible, but that's really winning back trust. Here's the third observation that I see in this portion of Scripture. Write this down. They diligently keep their word, even in the small things. They diligently keep their word, even in the very, very, very small things. Look with me, if you would, at Genesis chapter 43, verse 15. It says, so the men took the gifts and double the amount of silver and Benjamin also. They hurried down to Egypt and presented themselves to Joseph. So here's what they did. This is the first time they visited. They brought silver to buy the grain. Joseph was being merciful and grace-giving, and he put, not only did they get the grain, but he put all the silver they had paid for the grain back in their sacks. They got back to their father and said, "Oh my goodness, this is terrible. We also have to bring back Benjamin. What are we going to do?" The father didn't want to give Benjamin, but they ran out of food. So here's what they do. They double the amount of silver. So what they had in the sacks that Joseph gave them back, then an additional amount to buy new grain. So what they were saying is, I don't know if they meant to do this, but we're going to be faithful in this. We're going to be faithful to the small things. They could have just said, well, obviously they're being generous. That's not what they did. They said, no, we're going to give back. We're not going to take what doesn't belong to us. We're going to give it back. Here's what's important. It's important to show integrity. So let's just go back to the previous illustration. So it's financial infidelity. Trust actually gets built up not just in how you handle finances, but in how you handle a lot of other things. So it means showing up on time. It means when you say you're going to do something, you say, hey, I'll do the dishes tonight. You actually do the dishes. When you stop being trustworthy in other areas, it actually affects the area you're trying to rebuild trust in. So it's diligently keeping your word. When you say you're going to do something, you are faithful to do that. Even small, unrelated infractions have a way of eroding the trust that we want to rebuild. So here's the fourth observation. Write this down. They demonstrated a growing trust in God. They demonstrate this growing trust in God. So it's not just about trust in the area of failure, but it's also building this relationship with God, because ultimately all trust is grounded in our relationship with God. So as we begin to grow in our trustworthiness with God, it begins to build a trustworthiness with others. Look with me at Genesis chapter 44, verse 16. It says, "What can we say to my Lord?" Judah replied. "What can we say? How can we prove our innocence?" And now he goes back to God. He says, "God has uncovered your servant's guilt. We are now my Lord's slaves, we ourselves and the one who was found to have the cup." So he's saying, we're all your slaves. But he says we're your slaves because this is God's will. This is God's purpose. Now, what he's really going back to, and I don't know, maybe they had this guilt for a long period of time, but it seems to be, as the story is written, that there's this epiphany when they have this moment where they think they're going to die, and they think Benjamin's going to die, and their whole world is going to collapse. That this all is due to the fact that they sinned against their brother Joseph. And in fact, it really was, but not for their harm, but for their restoration. The whole point was that they would be restored to Joseph, but also restored into right relationship with God. Now, why is it important? Why is it important to say, hey, if I'm going to trust somebody, again, their relationship with God needs to be growing as well. There needs to be a rebuilding of trust with God. Because, like I said, all trust is founded in our trust that we're establishing with God. Now, does that mean that Christians won't ever fail us? Nope, they will. Christians will fail you because we're imperfect in our expression of who God is. However, if someone is trying to rebuild trust with you, alongside of that, they are rebuilding trust with God. And that should mean that they are growing more and more. Do you remember going to school and the teacher would leave the room? The teacher leaves the room and the troublemakers in the class would want to use that as an opportunity to disrupt the class or do some kind of nonsense in the classroom. And of course, it was the obedient kids, that the faithful ones, the ones that respected the teacher, that would try to get everybody to sit down or do the right thing because they didn't want to get in trouble. Kind of what we're talking about here. God is the teacher. And if we respect the teacher, we want to be sure that we honor him, that when his eyes are on us, he is, or that are obedient. But the fact of the matter is God's eyes are always on us. So we always want to be obedient. So what's the fifth observation? The fifth and last one is this. Write this down. They contribute to a reasonable plan of restoration and are faithful to it. They contribute, so they're part of the process, to a reasonable plan of restoration and are faithful to it. Joseph could have just established a plan and established trust based on whatever the plan was. But you know what he actually did? He actually gets the brothers to follow along with the plan. He gets his brothers to go along with it. So they are agreeing in sort of a pseudo contract with Joseph to go bring back their brother so that they can get more grain and actually get their brother out of prison. So they had reason to do it. Look with me at Genesis chapter 45, verse 4. It says, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' When they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt.'" Here's what working together and executing a plan to rebuild trust does. It actually unites you in relationship. And that's what the beauty of this whole story is not just Joseph's success, but the beauty of the story is that they are reunited, restored into relationship. And you probably know the rest of the story. The whole family is brought into Egypt. They settle in Goshen, and a nation is formed out of that whole experience. It reminds me of when my son, Jason, graduated from high school, became a young adult, and really kind of blew up his life. He made some really, really bad choices that affected his future, affected his well-being. It was hard. As a parent, you maybe understand this, that it's hard to watch your kids make a mess of their life. And I remember him coming to Jackie and I's house and talking about how terrible his life is and what a mess his life has become. He was very contrite, very humble, and in tears, he said, "Would you allow me to live with you until I can get things back together again?" And so we sat with him and we said, "Well, there's some things you're going to do. There's some things you're going to do around the house, and there's things you're going to need to do to prove that you're actually moving forward." And he did all of those things. He actually then became a part of an intern program at the church, and he was growing in his faith. So it wasn't just he was doing the right things around the house. His faith was growing, and he was establishing, I think, trust with God again. And the next thing I know, he's actually a youth pastor, and God's doing great things in his life. Now, fast forward years later, he's married, he's got a wonderful wife. He's a teacher, teaches Bible at a Christian school. His life is doing really well. That all happened because there was an observable trust that he was gaining over time. It was a long period of time. There was a delay of several years before finally trust was fully restored. But now that it's fully restored, life is really, really good for him, between us, and between he and his Lord. Now I want you to take some time around your small group to talk about what it means to observe trust. We've got some great questions for you. Hopefully your discussion is robust and really great. God bless you. Have a great time together.